The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as people waited for their cases to be called. Lawyers flipped through papers, their pens tapping rhythmically on desks. A clerk typed away at her keyboard, the sound of clicking keys blending into the background noise. Spectators sat in rows, some fidgeting impatiently, others whispering to each other about what might happen next. At the front of the room, Judge Evelyn Harper sat tall behind her bench, her expression calm but serious. She was known for being fair yet firm, a woman who took her job very seriously. On this particular afternoon, the agenda included an adoption hearing, a case that usually brought smiles and happy tears. Today, it involved a young boy named Daniel, who looked no older than 10. His big brown eyes darted around the room nervously as he stood beside a couple holding hands tightly. They were kind-looking people, dressed neatly in clothes that seemed chosen carefully for the occasion. The man adjusted his tie while the woman smoothed down her dress, both clearly excited about officially becoming Daniel's parents. Evelyn glanced at the file in front of her. It contained all the details she needed: Daniel's name, his history in foster care, and how he had come to live with this couple over the past year. Everything appeared to be in order. The couple had passed every test, met every requirement, and shown nothing but love and dedication toward Daniel. This should have been one of those heartwarming moments judges sometimes cherished, the kind where families grew stronger and lives changed for the better. But something felt different today. As Evelyn looked up from the paperwork, her gaze landed on Daniel. He wasn't acting like most kids in these situations. Instead of smiling or looking eager, he stood perfectly still, almost frozen. His small frame was rigid, and his hands gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Most children would squirm under such scrutiny, but not Daniel. He stared straight ahead, his eyes locked onto Evelyn with an intensity that made her pause. For a moment, she wondered if there was something wrong. Was he nervous? Scared? Or was it something else entirely? Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that his stare held more meaning than just curiosity. She tried to focus on the task at hand, reminding herself that this was a routine procedure. But deep inside, a tiny voice whispered that today might not be as ordinary as it seemed. As the proceedings began, Evelyn listened attentively as the couple answered questions about their readiness to adopt Daniel. They spoke confidently, their voices filled with warmth and sincerity. They talked about how much they loved him, how they dreamed of having him join their family, and how they promised to give him the best life possible. Their words painted a picture of happiness and hope, exactly what you'd expect from such a hearing. Yet, despite their heartfelt answers, Daniel remained silent. When it came time for him to speak, he hesitated. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "Do you have anything you'd like to say, Daniel?" she asked gently, trying to encourage him. Her voice carried a hint of kindness, a break from the usual formality of the courtroom. For a brief second, Daniel glanced away, his eyes scanning the crowd behind him. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned back to face her. And when he did, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet murmurs just moments before, now felt heavy with anticipation. Every eye was on him. His adoptive parents, the lawyers, the spectators, and most of all, Judge Evelyn Harper. She sat perfectly still behind her bench, her pen hovering over the documents in front of her. Her sharp professional exterior masked a flicker of curiosity that she couldn't quite suppress. There was something about this boy, something unspoken yet palpable, that tugged at her attention. Evelyn studied him closely. His hands were still gripping the edge of the witness stand, his small fingers white-knuckled from the effort. His face was pale, but his eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, seemed to hold secrets he wasn't ready to share. For a fleeting moment, Evelyn wondered if he was simply overwhelmed by the formality of the courtroom. After all, it wasn't every day a child found himself at the center of such an important legal proceeding. But there was more to it than nerves. Evelyn could sense it. It was as though Daniel was wrestling with a decision, weighing whether or not to say something that might change everything. The boy finally broke his silence, though not in the way anyone anticipated. Instead of answering Evelyn's question directly, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Do you know me?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft but clear. The words hung in the air like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Evelyn blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She glanced at the couple standing beside Daniel, searching for some clue, some explanation for his unusual question. But they looked just as confused as she felt. "I'm sorry," Evelyn replied, her tone measured but gentle. "What do you mean, Daniel? Do I know you from somewhere?" She tried to keep her voice calm, though her mind raced with possibilities. Had she met him before? Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Or was it something deeper, something tied to her past? Daniel didn't answer right away. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor for a brief moment. Then, as if gathering courage, he lifted his chin and locked eyes with her again. This time, there was no hesitation in his expression. "You feel familiar," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Like I've seen you before. Not here, though. Somewhere else." The courtroom seemed to grow quieter, if that was even possible. Even the rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the spectators faded into the background. Everyone leaned in slightly, their curiosity piqued by the strange turn of events. Evelyn felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Familiar? How could he possibly think they'd met before? She prided herself on being fair and impartial, on keeping her personal life separate from her work. And yet Daniel's words stirred something deep within her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Daniel," she began, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "This is the first time we're meeting, at least as far as I know. But if you have any questions or concerns, you can tell me. That's why we're here today, to make sure everything is okay for you." Daniel nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. He didn't look convinced. For a moment, it seemed like he might let the matter drop, retreating back into silence. But then, without warning, he took a step forward. His movement was slight, almost imperceptible, but it drew everyone's attention. He stared at Evelyn with an unwavering focus, as if trying to see beyond her robes, beyond her title, and into the person she truly was. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, his voice tinged with both wonder and uncertainty. "Someone important." Evelyn's breath hitched, though she quickly masked it with a composed nod. "That's interesting," she managed to say, her tone neutral. But inside, her thoughts were spinning. Who did he think she reminded him of? And why did his words feel like they carried so much weight? Whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. This hearing was about to take a turn she hadn't anticipated. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. Daniel's last words, "someone important," hung in the air, lingering longer than anyone expected. Judge Evelyn Harper sat frozen for a moment, her polished exterior cracking ever so slightly. She had spent years perfecting her ability to remain calm and composed under pressure, but this boy's quiet intensity was unlike anything she had encountered before. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he looked at her, as if he could see through every layer of her carefully constructed persona. Evelyn forced herself to blink, breaking the spell of his gaze. "Tell me more, Daniel," she said gently, leaning forward slightly. Her voice betrayed none of the unease bubbling beneath the surface. She wanted, needed, to understand what he meant. But deep down, another part of her was afraid to know. Afraid because there was something about his presence, his mannerisms, that stirred memories she had long buried. Daniel hesitated again, glancing briefly at the couple beside him. His adoptive parents exchanged worried looks, clearly unsure how to respond to their son's unexpected behavior. They had prepared for questions about their home, their love for Daniel, and their plans for his future. They hadn't prepared for this, a cryptic exchange between their soon-to-be adopted child and the judge overseeing the case. Taking a shaky breath, Daniel turned back to Evelyn. His small hands loosened their grip on the witness stand, though his knuckles were still pale. "I don't know how to explain it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like, when I look at you, I feel like I already know you. Like we've met before. But not here. Somewhere else." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the clerk stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she listened intently. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. She glanced at the file in front of her, flipping through the pages without really seeing them. There was nothing in the documents that suggested any connection between her and Daniel. No shared history, no mention of familiarity. Yet his insistence gnawed at her, pulling at threads of memory she had worked hard to tuck away. "I'm sorry, Daniel," Evelyn said after a pause, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think we've met before today. But maybe you're feeling nervous, or maybe you're thinking of someone else who looks like me." She offered him a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel shook his head firmly, surprising everyone with his conviction. "No," he said, louder this time. "It's not that. I know what I'm saying." He paused, taking another deep breath, as if gathering courage. Then, in a voice so clear and steady it silenced every corner of the room, he added, "You are my mother." The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The adoptive couple exchanged bewildered glances, their faces pale with shock. One of the lawyers dropped his pen, the metallic clatter echoing loudly in the sudden silence. Even the bailiff standing near the door froze mid-step, his hand resting on the handle. Evelyn felt the world tilt beneath her. For a split second, she thought she might faint. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, each beat reverberating in her ears. She stared at Daniel, her mind racing as fragments of memory surfaced. Memories of sleepless nights, tearful decisions, and a life-altering choice she had made nearly a decade ago. Could it be? Was this boy hers? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed despite the storm raging inside her. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. "What makes you say that?" He didn't hesitate. "I found some papers," he explained, his voice tinged with both determination and vulnerability. "They said my birth mother's name was Evelyn Carter. And then, when I saw your name on the schedule for today's hearing, I knew. I just knew." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Evelyn Carter. That had been her name before she married, and became Evelyn Harper, a name she hadn't used in years. The pieces clicked into place, undeniable and unavoidable. This boy, this child standing before her, was the baby she had given up for adoption all those years ago. Fate, in its cruel and unpredictable way, had brought them together again. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of Daniel's revelation settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket, suffocating yet impossible to ignore. Evelyn gripped the edge of her bench, her knuckles white, as tears welled up in her eyes. She had spent years telling herself that giving him up was the right thing to do, that she had given him a better chance at life. But now, faced with the reality of him standing there, calling her mother, she realized just how. The courtroom remained eerily silent, the kind of stillness that feels heavy and suffocating. Judge Evelyn Harper sat frozen, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, shock, guilt, longing, all colliding at once. She had spent years burying the memory of her past, convincing herself it was better left forgotten. But now, with Daniel standing before her, calling her mother, those memories came rushing back like a flood she couldn't stop. Evelyn's thoughts spiraled to a time nearly a decade ago, when life had been unbearably hard. She had been young then, just 22, and already struggling to keep her head above water. Her parents had disowned her after learning about the pregnancy, leaving her alone and scared. She worked 2 jobs just to afford rent, often skipping meals so she could save money for baby supplies. Despite her best efforts, the weight of responsibility became too much. Every night, as she held her newborn son in her arms, she wrestled with an impossible choice: keep him and risk failing both of them, or give him up for adoption and hope he would find a family who could provide everything she couldn't. It was a decision that haunted her every single day. She remembered sitting in a small, sterile office, signing papers that would sever her legal ties to her child. The pen felt impossibly heavy in her hand, each stroke of ink slicing through her heart. When they finally took him away, she cried until her voice was hoarse, clutching the hospital blanket he had been wrapped in, as if it were the last piece of him she'd ever have. Over time, she convinced herself that forgetting was the only way to survive. She changed her name, threw herself into her career, and built walls around her heart to protect herself from the pain of loss. But now, here he was, standing in front of her, alive and real, not just a distant memory anymore. Evelyn studied Daniel's face intently, searching for traces of the baby she once held. His eyes, those big, soulful eyes, were unmistakably hers. His smile, though hesitant, carried a warmth she recognized instantly. Even the way he tilted his head reminded her of herself. It was as if fate had conspired to bring them together again, tearing down the walls she had worked so hard to build. As the reality sank in, Evelyn noticed the confusion spreading across the faces of Daniel's adoptive parents. They exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier excitement replaced by uncertainty. She could see the questions forming in their minds. What did this mean for their family? Would Daniel's revelation change anything? Were they losing the son they had grown to love? Daniel, sensing the tension, turned to them. "I didn't mean to upset anyone," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I love you both so much. You're my family. But I needed to know where I came from. I needed answers." His words hung in the air, raw and honest, cutting through the silence like sunlight breaking through clouds. Evelyn felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but she blinked them back, determined to stay strong. For Daniel, for everyone watching. She knew she owed him an explanation, even if it meant reopening old wounds. Taking a deep breath, she stepped down from the bench, her movements slow and deliberate. The room watched in stunned silence as she approached Daniel, kneeling beside him so they were eye to eye. "Daniel," she began, her voice shaky but filled with emotion. "What you said, it's true. I am your birth mother." The admission felt like pulling a bandage off a wound. It hurt, but it also brought relief. "When you were born, I made the hardest decision of my life. I gave you up because I wanted you to have a chance at happiness, stability, and a future I couldn't give you then. I told myself it was the right thing to do, but that doesn't mean it wasn't painful. Every day since, I've thought about you, wondered how you were doing, hoped you were safe and loved." Her words tumbled out in a rush, as if she had been holding them inside for years. Daniel listened intently, his expression softening. For the first time, he saw the woman behind the judge's robe, the woman who had loved him enough to let him go. And in that moment, something shifted between them. The barrier of unfamiliarity began to crumble, replaced by a fragile but undeniable connection. The courtroom remained silent, witnesses to a story far more profound than any legal proceeding. Evelyn reached out tentatively, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I don't expect anything from you," she whispered. "But if you want to know more, if you want to understand, I'm here. I always will be." For the first time that day, Daniel smiled. A genuine, heartfelt smile. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. The courtroom, which had been silent just moments before, erupted into a flurry of reactions. Whispers spread like wildfire among the spectators, some leaning forward to get a better look at Daniel and Evelyn, while others exchanged shocked glances. Reporters who had been lingering outside for other cases suddenly perked up, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding within those walls. The air buzzed with speculation. What would happen next? Judge Evelyn Harper quickly called for a recess, her voice firm but tinged with emotion. She knew this situation required privacy, not public scrutiny. "This hearing is temporarily adjourned," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. Bailiffs moved swiftly to clear the courtroom, ushering out the curious onlookers and ensuring only essential personnel remained. As people filed out, their whispers grew louder, filling the hallway with fragments of theories and guesses about what had just transpired. Inside the now empty courtroom, Evelyn retreated to her chambers, shutting the door firmly behind her. Her hands trembled as she leaned against it, trying to steady herself. This wasn't how she had imagined her day going. Adoption hearings were supposed to be straightforward, filled with joy and hope for new beginnings. Instead, she found herself thrust into a deeply personal drama, one that brought back memories she thought she'd buried forever. Meanwhile, Daniel stood beside his adoptive parents, tears streaming down his face. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by a mix of relief and fear. He clung to his father's arm, seeking comfort as he tried to explain why he had spoken up. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said, his voice trembling. I needed to tell her. I couldn't keep it inside anymore." His adoptive mother knelt beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking his hair. "We're here for you, no matter what." Her words were meant to reassure him, but there was an undertone of uncertainty in her voice. She glanced at her husband, silently asking the same question they both had. What did this revelation mean for their family? Would Daniel's connection to Evelyn change the bond they had worked so hard to build? Back in her chambers, Evelyn paced back and forth, struggling to process everything. Memories flooded her mind, sleepless nights spent rocking her newborn baby, the crushing weight of loneliness, and the heart-wrenching decision to give him up. She remembered signing the adoption papers, each stroke of the pen feeling like a dagger to her soul. For years, she had convinced herself that letting him go was the right thing to do, that she was giving him a chance at a better life. But now, faced with the reality of him standing just feet away, calling her mother, she realized how incomplete her life had felt without him. She thought about Daniel's adoptive parents, the love and care they had poured into raising him, the sacrifices they had made to provide him with a stable home. They were good people, and she respected them deeply. Yet she couldn't deny the ache in her chest, the longing to reconnect with the child she had given up. It was a complicated web of emotions, one she wasn't sure how to untangle. When she finally returned to the courtroom after several minutes, her composure was restored, though her eyes still glistened with unshed tears. She took her place behind the bench once more, addressing the couple and Daniel directly. "This is clearly a unique situation," she began, her voice steady but gentle, "and it deserves careful consideration. Daniel, you've uncovered something incredibly important today, not just for you, but for everyone involved. We need to figure out how to move forward in a way that honors your feelings, your adoptive parents' commitment to you. And," she paused, swallowing hard, "the truth of our shared history." Daniel nodded slowly, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. "I don't want to lose anyone," he admitted softly. "You're my family," he added, looking at his adoptive parents. Then, turning to Evelyn, he continued, "But I need to know where I came from. I need to understand who I am." Evelyn felt her heart swell with pride and sorrow all at once. Here was this brave boy, standing in the middle of chaos, determined to find answers. She knew then that this wasn't just about reconnecting with her son, it was about helping him piece together the puzzle of his identity. And as difficult as it might be, she owed it to him to try. The courtroom felt different when everyone reconvened after the recess. The earlier tension had softened, replaced by a shared understanding that this was no ordinary adoption hearing. Judge Evelyn Harper sat behind her bench, but her usual stern demeanor was gone. Instead, she exuded a quiet vulnerability, her eyes softer, her movements deliberate. She glanced at Daniel, who stood between his adoptive parents, still holding onto his father's hand tightly. His face was red from crying, but there was a glimmer of hope in his expression now. Hope for answers, for connection, and for closure. Evelyn cleared her throat before speaking. What we've uncovered today is deeply personal and requires sensitivity, she began, addressing the couple and Daniel directly. Her voice carried both authority and compassion, striking a balance that put everyone at ease. Daniel has every right to know where he comes from. At the same time, your role as his adoptive parents is invaluable. You've given him love, stability, and a home. She paused, looking at them with genuine admiration. We need to find a way to honor both sides of this story. The adoptive couple exchanged a glance, their initial shock slowly giving way to acceptance. They had always known Daniel was adopted, and they had prepared him for the possibility of wanting to learn more about his birth family someday. But nothing could have prepared them for this. A courtroom revelation that tied their son's past directly to the judge presiding over his case. It was surreal, almost unbelievable, yet here they were. We just want what's best for Daniel, the adoptive mother said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice wavered slightly, but her words were sincere. If reconnecting with you helps him understand himself better, then we're okay with that. She looked at Evelyn, her gaze steady despite the storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. But we also want him to know that our love for him doesn't change. He'll always be our son. Evelyn nodded, visibly moved by their words. Thank you, she said softly, her gratitude evident. Then, turning to Daniel, she added, and thank you, Daniel, for having the courage to speak up. Not many people would have done what you did today. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I didn't mean to make things complicated, he murmured, glancing at his adoptive parents apologetically. I needed to know. Ever since I found those papers, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. His last words were directed at Evelyn, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. Daniel, she said, leaning forward slightly, I won't lie. It wasn't easy letting you go. Giving you up was the hardest decision I ever made. But I did it because I wanted you to have a life full of opportunities, a life I couldn't provide back then. Seeing you now, standing here with such wonderful parents, she gestured toward the couple beside him, her eyes shining with emotion. It tells me I made the right choice. You've grown into an incredible young man. Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. For years, he had wondered if being given up meant he wasn't loved or wanted. Hearing Evelyn say otherwise filled a void he hadn't realized existed. Why didn't you try to find me? He asked hesitantly, voicing a question that had lingered in his mind for weeks. Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I thought about it so many times, she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. But I worried it might confuse you, or worse, disrupt the beautiful life you were building. I told myself it was enough to imagine you happy and safe. And now, seeing you here, I see that you are. The room fell silent again, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. Daniel looked down at his shoes, processing her answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice firmer this time. I'm glad I found you, he said simply, even if it happened like this. A small smile tugged at Evelyn's lips, though tears threatened to spill from her eyes. So am I, she replied. Turning to address everyone present, she continued, this situation is unique, and it calls for a unique solution. After consulting with social services and considering all parties involved, I believe we can move forward in a way that benefits Daniel most. Your adoption will proceed as planned. You are, and always will be, his parents. She looked at the couple warmly before adding, however, I'd like to request visitation rights. If Daniel is comfortable with it, I'd like the chance to build a relationship with him, to be part of his life moving forward. The adoptive parents exchanged another glance, their earlier apprehension melting into cautious optimism. We trust Daniel to make the decision that's best for him, the father said. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for everyone involved. The adoption hearing had concluded with Daniel officially becoming part of his adoptive family, a moment filled with both joy and tears. But it wasn't just an ending. It was also a beginning. Evelyn, now granted visitation rights, found herself navigating uncharted territory as she worked to rebuild her relationship with the son she had given up nearly a decade ago. It was awkward at first, each meeting tinged with uncertainty, but over time, small moments of connection started to bridge the gap between them. Their first meeting took place in a quiet park near Evelyn's home. She arrived early, clutching a thermos of hot chocolate and a bag of cookies she had baked the night before. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited on a bench, watching families stroll by, children laughing, parents holding hands. When Daniel appeared with his adoptive father, her heart skipped a beat. He looked so much like her, yet so different, shaped by the years spent away from her. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, unsure how to begin. "Hi," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was soft but warm, carrying none of the hesitation he'd shown in the courtroom. "Hi, Daniel," Evelyn replied, smiling nervously. "Thank you for coming." They sat together on the bench, the crisp autumn air swirling around them. At first, their conversation was stilted, polite questions about school, hobbies, favorite foods. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. Daniel opened up about his love for drawing, pulling out a sketchpad to show her some of his work. Evelyn listened intently, marveling at his talent and offering gentle encouragement. In turn, she shared stories from her own childhood, tales of mischief and dreams that made him laugh. By the end of their hour together, the initial awkwardness had melted away, replaced by a tentative bond neither had expected to form so quickly. Back at home, Daniel's adoptive parents watched with cautious optimism. They had always known Daniel might one day seek answers about his birth family, but they never imagined it would lead to such an extraordinary reunion. Still, they reminded themselves daily that their role in his life hadn't diminished, it had simply expanded. They encouraged Daniel to share his feelings openly, reassuring him that his place in their family remained unchanged, no matter what happened with Evelyn. For Evelyn, these visits became a source of healing. Each moment spent with Daniel chipped away at the guilt and regret she had carried for years. She marveled at the person he had become, kind, thoughtful, and resilient, and couldn't help but feel proud of the life he was building. Yet she was careful not to overstep. She understood that Daniel already had a family who loved him deeply, and her goal wasn't to replace them, but to complement their efforts. Slowly, she earned their trust, proving through her actions that her intentions were pure. As winter approached, their bond grew stronger. One Saturday afternoon, Evelyn invited Daniel and his adoptive family to her house for a casual get-together. It was an idea born out of nervous excitement, a chance to blend their worlds in a way that felt natural rather than forced. The day started off tentatively, with polite introductions and guarded smiles. But as the hours passed, laughter filled the room. Evelyn taught Daniel how to bake cookies, while his adoptive mother helped set the table. His adoptive father regaled everyone with funny stories from Daniel's childhood, making even Evelyn chuckle. By the end of the visit, something remarkable had happened. What had once felt like two separate families connected only through Daniel now resembled something closer to one extended unit. There were still boundaries, of course, but there was also mutual respect and understanding. Evelyn realized she didn't need to fix everything overnight. What mattered most was being present, showing up consistently, and letting love guide the way. Daniel, too, felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. For years, he had wondered about the woman who gave him life, imagining countless scenarios of rejection or indifference. Instead, he found someone who cared deeply, who saw him not as a mistake, but as a miracle. And alongside that discovery, he reaffirmed the love he already had, an adoptive family who cherished him beyond measure. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of doubt, questions left unanswered, and emotions that sometimes bubble to the surface unexpectedly. But perfection wasn't the goal. Love was. And in that messy, imperfect journey, they were finding their way back to each other. Months had passed since that unforgettable day in the courtroom, and life for Daniel and those around him had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The small gathering at Evelyn's house marked a turning point, a moment when two families, once strangers, began to weave themselves into each other's lives. What started as tentative visits grew into shared meals, holiday celebrations, and even weekend outings. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of awkwardness, misunderstandings, and raw emotions bubbling to the surface. But through it all, they held on to one truth: love was worth fighting for. On a bright spring morning, nearly 6 months after the adoption hearing, Daniel stood between Evelyn and his adoptive parents at a small celebration held in his honor. Balloons swayed gently in the breeze, their cheerful colors reflecting the mood of everyone present. Friends, teachers, and neighbors mingled happily, laughing and chatting as plates of food were passed around. At the center of it all was Daniel, smiling widely, surrounded by people who loved him dearly. Evelyn watched her son from across the yard, marveling at how much he had grown, not just physically but emotionally. He seemed lighter now, freer, as if finding her had filled a void he hadn't fully understood until it was gone. She thought back to the little boy who had stood in the courtroom, trembling yet brave, and felt a swell of pride. That same boy now laughed easily, his sketches pinned proudly on the walls of her home alongside photos of their time together. They weren't perfect, but they were learning to trust, to forgive, and to embrace the beauty of their second chance. The adoptive couple sat nearby, watching their son with obvious affection. Though the journey had been challenging, they couldn't deny the positive impact Evelyn's presence had brought into Daniel's life. Their initial fears, that reconnecting with his birth mother might weaken their bond, had faded over time. Instead, they saw how Evelyn's involvement enriched Daniel's understanding of himself. He spoke often about feeling whole, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. And while they would always be his primary caregivers, they recognized the value of giving him access to his roots. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn approached Daniel, pulling him aside for a quiet moment. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked softly, gesturing toward a shaded corner of the yard. "Sure," Daniel replied, following her with a curious smile. Once they were alone, Evelyn knelt down to meet his gaze, something she had done instinctively since their first meeting. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for letting me back into your life, for trusting me. I know I missed so much, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that. But every moment we share now, it means everything to me." Daniel looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't have to make up for anything," he said earnestly. "You gave me a family, a really great one. And now I have you too. That's enough." Evelyn pulled him into a tight hug, unable to hold back her tears any longer. In that embrace, years of longing, guilt, and hope melted away. They weren't defined by the past anymore. Instead, they were building something new, something stronger. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky, Daniel stood holding hands with both his adoptive mother and Evelyn. The three of them posed for a photo, capturing a moment that symbolized unity, resilience, and unconditional love. It was a picture that told a story far greater than words ever could, one of loss, redemption, and the power of connection. As fireworks lit up the night sky to celebrate the occasion, Daniel gazed upward, his heart full. He knew his journey wouldn't always be smooth, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Between his adoptive family and Evelyn, he had found not one but two places where he belonged. And in those bonds, he discovered something invaluable: the courage to face whatever came next, knowing he was loved more deeply than he could ever imagine. In the end, the courtroom drama had led to something extraordinary, a fractured family finding a way to heal. As Evelyn hugged Daniel tightly, she whispered, "I may have lost you once, but I'll never let you go again." And this time she meant it.